Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the weekly live stream for the Rest Is Due to Orbis channel. And as always, I'm your host, Lucius Aurelian, and I have decided that we are going to explore the post-reset horror, year 1800s, or sometime thereabouts in the 1800s. First off, let me extend a greeting to all Prime Explorers, viewers, and all others joining us. Welcome to all, and please share your opinions as we go out through this exploration. What I wanted to do, though, a little different with this particular exploration is I wanted to start by setting the stage, if you will, or perhaps the better way to say it is to set the image in your minds. And it's really good to see everyone, but this might not exactly be the perhaps most positive or hopeful outlook of an exploration, but I think it's important to understand what events preceded where we are today. I'm Kairos. It's good to see you. Thanks for joining us. And everybody else. But when you look at this image, are you seeing potentially a representation of an event that may have happened in the distant past, perhaps the years that we think of as the 1800s? Could it have been something that happened even more recently? Yes, that's entirely possible. And maybe it happened much further before. But I want you to go back right to the end of that hard reset event, whatever cataclysm occurred, or whether it was the last conflict that destroyed the previous civilization that on this channel we call Tartaria. And when you see this particular image, what you have here are what appear to be some airships and some very heavily armored figures that seem to be not only destroying any creature they come across, but the actual land itself. We're going to be taking a look at some of the evidence that we have. Evidence, pictures, images. But remember, pictures are clues. They're not conclusive evidence because, as we know, any photo from any time frame can be changed. It can be altered. We also do not know if that photo actually emanated from that particular time frame. Yes, we can accept it potentially as a fact, but it's a question that we have to ask. And perhaps what I believe that we have here with this image is this does represent an image that occurred in the past, where we had some sort of airships, or maybe even not airships, perhaps something even more advanced than airships that were causing destruction on the land. I wanted to highlight this image of artwork from 1970s pulp science fiction. And I've always found that artwork very fascinating because typically, while they're supposed to be set in space battles and what we would think of traditionally as space, or the science fiction concept of space, what you tend to see in these images is, one, space doesn't look like space, and they're often set on the ground. And oddly enough, what you see are advanced craft or flying machines engaging in aerial combat, or they're wreaking destruction on the land at a massive level. And we're going to go back and find that connection that still endures in our psyche to this day across all societies through the land. Everyone seems to have a fear of the destruction of the land, or the end of the world, as they call it, the apocalypse. When is the world going to end? Now, of course, we'll associate that with a reset event, but when is the world going to end again? Well, the answer is I don't know. And yes, there are plenty of people out there that will tell you that they know. Elizabeth Clara Prophet thought that she knew, but she was proven to be wrong. So maybe somebody does know and they'll get it right in the future. It's just interesting to note that many people have predicted in the past and they've been wrong many times. So I'm not preaching doom and gloom here, merely being aware of what happened in the past. But I always found these science fiction artists very interesting from the 1970s because this was all in that time frame from our understood history, and at least what seems to be a little bit more accurate because, yes, I did live through this time frame. So I know that these events occurred. There was this fear about nuclear conflict that occurred back during this time. And this fear that was very, very powerful. The fear that the entire world was going to end and it would be destroyed by nuclear devastation. And yet we always had this recurring theme that would come up. Now you see an image such as this, and perhaps an image like this does actually represent what kind of technology and what a late era look at the fourth era, or the civilization that preceded ours before it fell, what their capabilities really were. Vast structures and spires that reach to the sky. And the question will be, what happened to all these buildings? How come we still don't have these extensive cities? Well, the answer is we have the remnants of them. We have some structures that survived. But as the theory goes, the major structures, such as some of the most impressive we could imagine, were completely destroyed. And what's the evidence for all this? Well, the clues are in the images that we'll look at. But for right now, just imagine that there was this technological capability in the civilization that preceded ours. Now, if they had the technological capability to create these stunning structures, and indeed structures such as the Beacon of Progress, which we're told did not exist, but we have better plans and better diagrams for it than we do for many of the structures that do exist. So make of it what you will. It could just simply be a historical anomaly. It could simply be poor record keeping, or any other number of rational explanations, as naysayers would say, and they may be right. But I believe that the evidence points to the fact that we do have something else that happened, something far more dramatic and profound. Now, you see an image like this, and this is a little bit more of a, dare I say, hybrid of that science fiction art from that 1960s and 1980s time frame. Yeah, I know I said 1970s. I'm expanding it because the early 80s, they had some pretty good sci-fi artwork as well, in my opinion. Maybe you don't like it, and that's all right. But I think it got to the point of showing what that fear really was. Some very large craft, very advanced in the sky, wreaking destruction on the land. And indeed, this actually conforms to two fears that we have in our mind. And that fear that people point back to the Cold War will say, we feared aliens, we feared creatures invading and destroying us with advanced technology. And that was a representation of our collective conscience fear of nuclear annihilation. And that's what this artwork was really to capture. Thoughts on this so far? Let's see what we've got. Jamie is Dark Materials. Yes, that's always a good one to reference. And the Heavy Metal movie. Yes, that's a good one to reference as well. What's a Real Story? And we did cover that, didn't we, in the past? So, and Julie S., it reminds me of the War of the Worlds. And indeed, perhaps that was the very origin of that collective fear that we had. And so that's what we really have to look at. Now, people will say, yes, the continuous fires, the continuous destruction, although that's always happened. The only thing that seems to happen, much like with the weather, is that we're told that this is a new catastrophic event. It hasn't happened before. Although I can remember fires occurring in California since 2000 and even before. It's just they weren't covered so extensively. But, you know, as I'm famed for saying, make of it what you will. But you see these images, and we'll look at a few more. Yes. Here we have the still from the film The Day After with famed actor Jason Robards. And World War II veteran. You might recall we were trying to figure out which ship he was on during World War II. Was he on the Honolulu or was he on the Northampton? Who do we trust? U.S. military records or some foreign conglomerate interest? I don't know. Either one could be right and both could be discredited. But Jason Robards is no longer with us. Anyway, in the film The Day After, we saw the city of Kansas City completely destroyed by not one but two hydrogen bomb attacks, direct intercontinental ballistic missile attacks. And the film laid out the reality of how grim this would really be. And this created a lot of fear in people. It was directed by Nicholas Meyer. He was really the creative force behind it. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Nicholas Meyer was the creative genius behind Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, still considered the best Star Trek movie and still the movie they are inspired by to this day. In any event, he had a shoestring budget and still pulled off a very convincing and horrifying nuclear war flick. Although there were a lot of nuclear war films that were very terrifying from that time frame. Threads, United Kingdom, which is stated to have really set the bar on that because they had their earlier film from the 1960s called The War Game. But all these films alluded to the same thing, the destruction of civilization, the destruction of society by tremendously apocalyptic weapons that caused destruction off the charts. There's even an interesting scene where Jason Robards goes by Liberty Tower, or what's left of it, after it's been struck by these two hydrogen bombs. And that's really how the film ends, when he somehow finds the wreckage of his house. Apparently he knew which house was his in this amazing pile of rubble. How he did that, don't ask me, but it's rather intriguing. But you look at some of these other images, and of course this will be referred to as the steampunk mentality, and yet whenever I've tried to associate steampunk with Art Deco, and then of course with the other concepts of the Fourth Era, it's not exactly been received well. Now, what do I mean by received? Well, the idea doesn't seem to be popular, even though the visual impression does seem to give an idea of what things could be. So when that happens, that gives me the impression that perhaps there's a little something more to what we're looking at. Perhaps this really was a real image. Oddly enough, you might notice that the creative inspiration that went into science fiction has been perhaps there's not as many varieties, is the best way to say it. Everything has been very, very conformed to certain streams of thought. In other words, science fiction now looks a lot the same, whether you're watching a Star Trek film, a Star Wars film, or even modern Doctor Who. They all kind of look the same. There used to be more of a difference with them in the past, even though special effects were limited. And perhaps that was the most impressive thing about Nicholas Meyer's efforts with The Day After. It was a TV film in 1983, and he did it with a shoestring budget. But when you see some of these images, are they giving you the impression of what sort of vehicles and capabilities were really available? And to include potentially some sort of enclave or some sort of force, if you will, that was reserved for use in destroying what was left of the civilization after the reset. And that's really what the post-reset horror is all about. And so we get a better idea in some of these images with what some of these craft were really capable of. What kind of destruction could they actually rain from the sky? Now, of course, the practicality and the availability of nuclear weapons in our current civilization is at best questionable. We're assured that they're there, and I'm not here to question that to this day, but I'm merely referring to the fact that we've been very, very lucky, in parentheses, because there's never been a full nuclear exchange. In fact, nuclear weapons have never been used in combat, and they've never been used in any sort of, how shall we say, unsanctioned action by what they call a non-state actor, if you follow me. But if you imagine, if you visualize that there was a civilization that really had this destructive capability. And the thing about nuclear weapons is their destructive capability is not very controlled, at least as we understand it. Now, we understand that there's different types that may be a little bit more controlled, the neutron bomb that could leave the city standing while killing every living thing, the other varieties of it. But think about the past if you had something with more advanced destructive technology that could be more controlled. In other words, imagine if you just had a beam that you could hit a single building with and just completely annihilate the building. Only one single building. But then you also had a weapon, and we're not theorizing on the weapons, not yet. This is not a technology video. We're merely considering this event and looking at the evidence. But then you could change the capability of the beam and you could wipe out larger portions of the city. And you see some of this artwork from the time frame, and oddly enough, this does seem to endure in our collective conscience. Now, this is more of what we would think of as a modern representation of the fear of nuclear war. But it's very peculiar to me that it seems to have been very carefully pulled out of the mainstream. Now, yes, you'll still hear the references to it, but nobody's really making any nuclear war scare films now. They certainly haven't in this century. I mean, I guess there have been a couple low-budget examples. I think there was that one with Eddie Furlong from Terminator 2 called Aftermath, and that was done on a very shoestring budget in the early 2010s. Outside of that, I mean, I'm really not familiar with any of the very well-known post-apocalyptic films or the nuclear war fear films that we had from the 1980s. And they had quite an impact, and everybody saw them. I don't think anybody's really seen this Aftermath film with Eddie Furlong. Nothing against Eddie Furlong. You know, I know he had some struggles after Terminator 2. It was just interesting that he ended up in a movie like that. And what was really high mainstream or post-apocalyptic movies, and you might recall Terminator 2 had that theme as part of it, it was completely removed from our films now. And I know you're always saying, well, why are you always referencing films? Because our films are really what we're supposed to think. It's what we're supposed to think about, and it's what we're supposed to consider. Now, you can argue that, but that's what's brain food for the masses. Because what do people do? They go out and they watch movies. That's why I pay attention to films. That's the one thing that seems to have been quite the same from then as it is now. And do we have other platforms to see films? Sure, but do we really have the same messages that get pushed out to everyone? Absolutely. And obviously, what messages are allowed to be shown, or excuse me, what messages are encouraged, that has changed over time quite immensely. But yet there's still some things that endure. So that's what I've always found fascinating about this. And when you look at some of this steampunk mentality, you might be surprised to know that there is a lot of overlap with it and actual images. Now, this is actually an artistic rendition of steampunk. And yet you may recall in our earlier exploration on technology last month, or no, wait, it was 2 months ago already. Time's going by quick on me. Back in December last year, we saw that there was a fabrication photo of this where they were making large naval artillery. And we were really trying to figure out how we jumped from our cannons to the large naval artillery that's still used to this day. And so here's where things start to blend together: the reality with the fantasy. Where's the difference? And that's a question I ask all of you. Hmm. Carol, nuclear weapons are just a made up boogeyman. Well, you know what's interesting, Carol? Whether they're real or whether they're made up, they oddly enough have the exact same effect. And maybe that's really what we need to be paying attention to. What effect does it have on our minds? Because if you really did have a weapon that could do that, let's say we could just, pull out 10 Tsar bombas with over 50 megatons, what good would they be? They would destroy everything and they'd scatter radiation all over the place. Of course, the Tsar Bomba was one of those clean bombs, so that's why it didn't scatter radiation all over the Arctic Circle and everywhere else. At least that's what the official history says. So who knows for sure? But they have a profound psychological impact. Battlestar Utarian says, always leaking truth in film and television programs to control the masses. And it's truth that's mixed with some very questionable things, and that's just how things are. That's how popular culture rolls and how it always has. Ishko, good to see you. We have records of ancient battles where only the armies take part in the actual conflict on a battlefield outside of any settlements, no destroying cities. How and when and why did that change? And it is an interesting premise because you're talking about that time frame. They even say it was as late as the 1600s where they had small professional armies. I mean, that's what the official history will say. But it's really, really odd. Really odd. So when you think about how this concept changed, how it went from a small professional conflict to what we would think of as total war. And here's one of the images from the film The Day After. And Nicholas Meyer used some very rudimentary special effects, but they were effective enough in conveying the message. And the fact is that basically all of America, at least we're informed, tuned into this television film. And once the nuclear attack started, there were no commercials. Interestingly enough, imagine having that kind of influence and that kind of pull to have a film released like that. And it's very, very strange because that was during the time of the Reagan administration, and I'm not getting political here, but the Reagan administration had a reputation for confronting the Soviet Union. This was the latter stage of the Cold War, head on. So why would anybody have even thrown out the production budget for this film? And of course, you have your usual political arguments and maybe. What's really interesting, though, about Nicholas Meyer is after Star Trek VI, his career didn't really seem to take off like we'd think it was. I mean, nobody questioned how creative the guy was and how talented he was, but it's really odd that he didn't seem to really be involved in any other films or television efforts, really, once he got past the early 1990s. Very, very strange. Now, you see some images like this, and again, this is from that science fiction artwork from the 70s and the 80s, and yet again, you're thinking of that blending of more advanced technology and the utter destruction of cities. And how interesting that in this particular one, we see a Capitol building under heavy fire and actual burning. Now, of course, we always ask that question, what kind of weapon would cause such materials to catch fire and burn? Perhaps, back in that time frame, they did have weapons that could really cause that. Although I've certainly seen modern conflict up close and personal, and it's always intriguing to me how the military, to this day, classifies certain structures for what they call urban warfare. I'm not sure if that's what they call it currently. The terms are always changing, just like the dictionary is always changing. But whatever they tend to call it, they always favor the structures like this as being the most protective if you're in any kind of direct arms firefight. So this is with modern weapons. You don't want to get in one of these glass and steel buildings. That does not offer you what is called cover. What you get in what they call is a mass constructed building, or a building that has masonry construction. Again, different terms, but we know what it really is. And for some unknown reason, you're a little bit more protected in there. Why is it all those state capitals seem to be bulletproof, even though the official historical account tells us that, oh, those rickety old things were falling apart. Those cheap cornerstones that they used in the 1800s, they were falling apart, but somehow they're still standing. And it's, well, we're almost, we are a quarter of the way into this current century. I don't know. Don't ask me to explain it. But you see these kind of images, and these are the things that reflect our collective fear. whether you want to call it War of the Worlds, alien invasion, or fear of nuclear annihilation, or just fear of the end of the world. Many different terms for it. But that's what I always found interesting about how these images were so profound during this time frame and why they were so promised at that time, because we were supposed to be more hopeful and optimistic, but we had this reality that was ingrained within our minds. We understood that perhaps somebody had a technology, would have a technology, or had a technology in the past to where not only could they destroy the land, but they could be very, very discretionary in what they destroyed and how they destroyed it. Now, if you really think about that, if you could be discretionary in what you destroy and when you destroy it, and let's just say if you want to limit it to a single building or a very small area, it does actually give you a lot more effective power to control and terrorize a population. And if you just have large bombs that go off and destroy everything, well, yeah, it's just mutual assured destruction, mad, and it just doesn't make any sense from any perspective. And that's how we explain it not ever happening. Fine. And fortunately, nobody out there turns out to be mad or insane, right? At least nobody in charge. So that's how we'll explain it. But I've always been fascinated by how powerful of a psychological effect this is, not just on the individual, but also on an entire civilization, entire groups of people, entire societies. And if you were around in 1983 when The Day After came out, that film with Jason Robards, it did have a very profound psychological effect. And I think that's really what we're dealing with when we consider this kind of exploration, when we're trying to understand what the post-reset horror was that occurred in the past. What you got? Katie wants to go. Oh, add 13 crucified saviors to the timeline. Yeah, maybe so. And thank you very much for that. And maybe that happened in the distant past in a previous era. It's hard to really say. Well, Michael, it's whatever you want to call it. There's many different names for what these craft may have been. Maybe just think of some futuristic science fiction craft or however you want to term it. And maybe it had capabilities that we couldn't even imagine. Vaughn says, left the buildings to put on their show. Yeah, pretty much. So that's really looking at it overall, trying to understand the post-reset horror year 18XX. What year did it actually happen? I don't know. For all we know, it could have been the early 1900s. Again, that's just a placeholder. Remember, I'm not too confident in the chronological timeline that we have. So let's go on and look at this concept, the evidence that reinforces this notion: mystery airships and fire from the sky. So give me 1 second, and we're going to transition to our next portion of images for this particular exploration, looking at the mystery airships. Now, you may not be familiar with the concept, maybe you are. Everybody understands the concept of UFOs and how that started right after World War II with the flying saucers. But there was a time frame in the late 1800s when we had mystery airships. And what's this fire from the sky? Hey, thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. And welcome to the new members. Yeah, War of the Worlds. And that's right when that was written too, villain. It's a good point. So when you consider this, though, and here we have some images, and we have a compilation of pictures of an airship visiting Des Moines, Iowa. How interesting that there are pictures of a small airship, albeit that's around Des Moines, Iowa. Now, this was not a mystery airship. This was a very well documented invention that someone was showcasing, and they were showcasing it around landmarks, and they've got some actual pictures, at least what you can call it as actual pictures. But then we go beyond that, and we go about 10 years before that official image in the 1890s. There were all kinds of media releases that talked about winged ships in the sky, and nobody knew who was behind these great airships, as they called them, and they were seen all over the land. Now, did this really happen? Was this merely a case of someone's imagination gone wild? What are your thoughts on these mystery airships, and what do they really represent? Oh, yeah. Brian refers to the Connecticut State Capitol building. Yeah, I would say, in my humble estimation, that's a close second, or one that competes with the Iowa State Capitol. So, what you got here? And I remember the Goodyear blimp flying over our home often as a kid. I was fascinated with it. And just remember, the Goodyear blimp, as interesting as it is not as advanced as the original rigid airships that we had, fascinatingly enough. So, but yeah, the Goodyear blimp, and you can still see it here and there. But you think of all these accounts that we have of these mystery airships. Did this really happen? Was this really a historical event? We've got mystery airships going all over the United States in the 1890s. Or was this really just to act as a cover for something else? And what you have here is an image from the Great Peshtigo Fire. The Peshtigo Fire from the early 1870s. It occurred in the exact same time frame that the Great Chicago Fire did. Now, at least that's what the official history tells us. Of course, when we have all these different cities being destroyed in these great fires, the question we have to ask is somebody manipulating, either intentionally or unintentionally, the when behind all this. With the Peshtigo Fire, we had a rural area in Wisconsin, north of Green Bay, north of the actual bay itself, in that vicinity. We'll look at a map in a second, where there were fires, a giant fire that broke out, and the only way that people could survive is as you see in this image right here. They had to huddle in the middle of a field and try to dig fire breaks and survive the fire. Now, oddly enough, these great fires were not ever known to hit the Midwest. It's very interesting. And when you think of that and you have this other interesting image here, I like how they just scratched out airship. Why would someone be using an experimental airship to load and unload on a tower of the structure? This is one of those images that I find quite fascinating. And again, I really question it. What is it authentic? Did this really happen? Is this some cut down airship that somebody had that survived? Or was this just a personal travel airship? And it's not an image I've showed before because, again, it's one of those images that I question. But just the concept of a small cupola on top of any random building, yet it's very clearly appears to be an old world building from what we can understand, although don't know, can't actually walk on it and confirm it. It's fascinating to me, though, because it gives that clue. Now, here's something else that's odd. During World War I, there were these great German airship bombing raids that occurred on various cities, to include the United Kingdom. Although finding images of these great bombing raids is not exactly an easy task. And as we understand it, this was not a very effective tactic, although it was really more of a psychological warfare tactic. Although World War I considered the first total war where they were actually targeting the population, although the United States Civil War and virtually every other war in the 1800s tells a very different story. They actually were targeting the population in the 1800s. And no, William Tecumseh Sherman did not invent total war. It was happening way before then, according to the official historical accounts. But we're just going to call it something different. Again, rewriting the dictionary. Beyond all that, though, what is your thought on this terrifying event in World War I? These Zeppelins and these bombing raids. Very, very difficult to document, and yet you can actually find memorials that are still across the United Kingdom to this day about these bombing raids. Not quite the Blitz, but something very different, something very interesting. As though it's alluding to something that did happen. Well, Doc Shelley, I mean, the whole war, there were parts of it that were psychologically terrifying. I do believe there was a conflict that occurred, although what was the exact nature of that conflict, that's certainly up for debate. So, I am Kairos, likely the same weapons that caused the world fires. And that would probably make a lot of sense, especially if we consider how, if we look at certain events, just take all the events from, say, 1820 to 1920, and imagine if that entire timeline is a lot more confused than we even begin to wonder. What if it's actually all referring to similar events? Oh yeah, it was World War I. And Sheriff Fortunes, yes, history is written by the winner, but what if it was already the same winner? And that's why we talk about the post-reset horror. The winner that's imposing its will on what remains of the civilization on the land to ensure that it is completely eradicated and destroyed. And maybe that's how we actually explain all these events. The real explanation that this when is actually a lot more confused than we like to realize. I always found this image fascinating because this is purportedly an image of one of those mystery airships just going over a random farmhouse in the 1890s. I do wonder if this is a little bit more legitimate image, but again, no way to know, and certainly it has its problems like all these other images from this time frame. So who knows how much of the truth that we get in the image. Now, I'm not suggesting that it's a fabricated image. Oh, no, no, no. It's just that it's been subjected to the forces of time and erosion, as we would expect a real photo to be subjected to. Much like the paper records that we're always reliant on to verify history, because guess what happens to paper once it's been around longer than 100, 200 years? It has a habit of not lasting. And yes, people will acknowledge this, historians, of course, but then they'll tell you, well, there's other records, there's copies of copies, and we only have access to the records, and never question the fact that we've rediscovered the Roman Empire 5, 6, 7 times, all right? We always know it was there. That's why it's kind of funny when I was watching The Last Kingdom, and yet they reference having knowledge of the Romans in that show. But, it's just a TV show, so it doesn't prove anything at the end of the day. There are some of these images, though, that do seem to be contrived a little bit more. Now, the official explanation could be everybody was into airships in the early 1900s, so they wanted to show airships everywhere doing everything. But compare and contrast this with the earlier image that we looked at. Is it a verifiable image, or is it just something that they're trying to encourage the population with? Well, if it is, then what it is it's evidence of photo manipulation in the past. And we don't need to talk about that because we've got numerous examples of photo manipulation, and even the mainstream admitting that, yes, they manipulated a photo, such as when they showed the Wisconsin state capitol crushed in the early 1930s as an April Fool's joke. It's a manipulated photo. It didn't really happen, but we released it as an April Fool's joke. So, yes, it always gets so confusing because, the media is confusing. But that's all right. You don't go to the media to tell you what a conspiracy is. Mainstream tells you go to a historian or a scientist. They will tell you the difference between conspiracies and conspiracy theories. The media, they can bombard you with conspiracies and conspiracy theories, and they're not accountable for it because that's their job. Anyways. What's this from Alex? Well, I don't know. I doubt we're going to go back to airships. I doubt that. Julia S. Oh, that looks silly, like Spaghetti Trees video. Yeah, it does look pretty silly, doesn't it? And that's what you tend to get with it. Now, this image here, and this is a bit of this is definitely a fabricated image, but this was to really show one of the accounts of what caused the Peshtigo fire in Wisconsin. There were accounts of some sort of black orb in the sky or black sphere that was raining fire down on the forests. Now, oddly enough, you can look at the accounts from this, and these are contemporary accounts. In other words, they were recorded accounts from the time, at least according to the official history. But what if there really were aerial devices that were raining fire down, and that's what caused all these fires? What if this is actually referring to the true event that occurred? Because if you think about it, if you have all these cities and all this infrastructure and you're looking to start a new civilization, the last thing you could do is leave all of this infrastructure for the population and the survivors to have access to. You need to limit it. You need to destroy that which is not needed. And so what's the best way to do that? Well, if you have a technological implement, if you have weapons of destruction like this, controlled, wide, and specific destruction, or surgical precision, as they also like to say in the military, then suddenly you have the ability to do this. Perhaps there really was also an effort to target the means for the population to sustain themselves. So what do you go after? You go after the agriculture. You completely destroy it. And we'll look at some evidence of that here in a little bit, of lands that we traditionally think of fertile, especially in what's called the breadbasket of the United States, the Midwest. You'll see that they didn't always look fertile. That also includes the South. It's very intriguing. Now, this is where the Peshtigo fire occurred. And I mean, you're looking at wide swaths of destruction, much more destructive and much more devastating than anything that we hear about today. Now, apparently there were other weather factors that affected this. This was October 8th, 1871. And you can get an idea for just how widespread this fire really was. Now, of course, they're saying that the wind spread it. And if you're familiar with the Green Bay area, you'll know and understand that this is a very lush area. There's lots of trees there. And as you go further up into northern Wisconsin, the forests only grow. And Door County and Door Peninsula is also a widely known vacation spot. It's where I swear half the population of Chicago goes, aside from northern Wisconsin. It's a joke. That's a joke. It's just very beautiful. But it was completely destroyed in 1871 by this fire. That occurred at the exact same time the Chicago fire. So I guess we didn't have a cow kicking over anything here, although you get different accounts and stories in terms of what happened, so it's hard to say. Now, back to that whole concept of mystery airships. When you see an image like this, you might be surprised to know that this is snapped over the very small town of Berlin, Iowa in 1911. Berlin, Iowa was renamed to Lincoln, Iowa, because, of course, the there was World War I going on, and you weren't going to have a town named Berlin, even if it was a small town of a couple hundred people. Odd that a small town of a couple hundred people, if it's even that to this day, had an airship that flew right over it in 1911. But, maybe the airship just wanted to be seen over the small town. Now, compare and contrast that with the earlier photos of the airship that we saw over Des Moines, Iowa. Now, again, this is still Iowa, but once again, it seemed like everything was going on there. Well, we've got more to say about that. So with that, before we go on our first break, be sure that you hit that like button. Appreciate you supporting the channel. So just to recap so far, we've looked at the concept of the post-reset horror, the fact that there was some sort of enclave with advanced technology that was raining destruction to remove the remaining civilization. We've also recounted the fact that there was a time when we had mystery airships and mysterious destruction that was occurring in the 1800s. So when we come back after our intermission, we're going to look at some photos that show us that destruction. Not just the cities, we've seen plenty of those, but also the landscape. So hit the like button. We're going on intermission, and I'll see you in 2 minutes. Okay, and we are back. And we're going to switch to take a look at some of those destroyed cities and lifeless lands that we have all over the place. I'll give everybody a chance to get logged back on. And let's go on to our next set of images here. Now, just understand that some of these images that we look at, we're going to be looking at a variety of different things. The first one I want to look at, though, we're looking at Seminary Hill, 17th and Madison Street in Dubuque, Iowa. Now, this is one of those postcards. Dubuque, Iowa is a very interesting place. It's a river city off the Mississippi, but you have this very peculiar retaining wall that's been constructed there. And it's up on a high bluff, and yet you get the impression of previous destruction in this retaining wall. Now, oddly enough, rather humorously, and I use the term loosely, they had some destruction of the retaining wall that occurred, it was probably about 15 years ago. And all it was a small section, so maybe just a part like this, that came out. And they asked the city if they were going to replace or repair it. And they said it would be prohibitively expensive to do so. Very, very fascinating, don't you think? But when you see an image like this, it gives you an idea potentially of how destruction was brought down in the distant past. And when you go to some of these older cities, you get the idea that this might not have been in the distant past as we think. Who actually built the retaining wall? Well, if you look at the bird's eye view maps of Dubuque, Iowa, they show a bird's eye view map without a retaining wall. And then a few years later, it's there, almost like it's magic. I don't know, maybe it was magic, but it's just one of those interesting observations that you notice. And you can go visit this retaining wall. It's still there in Dubuque, Iowa to this day. So, share fortunes. Yeah, I mean, it's in a lot of cities where you have these gigantic retaining walls. And there's those very interesting photos of excavation that occurred in Kansas City, as there is in many other interesting cities. So let's take a look at some more of these images and really deep dive into this, because this is one of them. Now, what you have here is an early image of what is today Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa. Yes, we're looking at Iowa. There's a reason for that. And you'll notice that in this image, stated to be from, I think, the 1890s, because this is the old main building. It's no longer there. You'll never guess what happened to it. Yep, disappeared in a fire. Morrill Hall over here, though, which is named after the Morrill Act, is still there. And some of these other structures still are. Now, what's the veracity of this image? I don't know. But it's intriguing when you think of the fact that we're informed that Iowa was originally all prairie grass. But here we see a lot of trees. Well, what do you see when you look at the terrain in Iowa? You've got trees where there's sources of water, and you have a lot of flipping cornfields. The soil is known for that. Now, we transition from that to an image of Chicago, and we've seen many of these city destruction images. There's no shortage of them, where you see complete and total destruction of buildings. Now, I've had a lot of people in the comments try to convince me that the reason that there are these diagonal cuts of destruction here and what appear to be brick and masonry constructions is because apparently somehow wood was involved. Wood was integrated in this at the time, and that's how we explain this. No, it doesn't make any sense to me either. I'm merely respectfully relating the opinion of another and what they stated, how they try to explain it. I think the reality is there is no rational explanation, that we theorize that perhaps there were more advanced weapons. Either that or this is not an accurate photo. A couple different possibilities to consider. But you've seen all these images before, and there's no shortage of them, of these mass destruction photos that we seem to have precision destruction that occurred as a result of a fire, which I find very baffling, and always have and probably always will. Oh, that's a good one there, Donk. I gotta get back to my 719. Well, it's all right. Battlestar Utarian, definitely lasers. Definitely something with a precision ability to inflict destruction. That's what I see when I see an image like this. But, I mean, it does. But then again, we see more than that, don't we? We see precision destruction, which is really strange. We would expect a conflagration not to have precision destruction. Hey, Kathy, the cities were intentionally set on fire. Yeah, I don't think there was any doubt on that. Now, of course, it depends on the city and the images that we're looking at. Of course, we'll be told that the cities down south were deliberately destroyed, or as Jamie Griffin says here very directly, looks blitzkrieged. Yes, in a manner of speaking. Hopefully you're not talking Master of Orion 3. No, that game was not fun. It was like doing your taxes. Probably shouldn't be saying that with tax season coming up. But in places like Dubuque, Iowa, and all over the land, really, you see structures like this that did survive. What they'll tell you is some sort of incredible granite or some sort of specially named rock. And we've seen these kind of structures all over the place, and they're still standing to this day in total perfection. So is it possible that some structures resisted the destruction, that even they were impervious to these weapons? Or were they spared for some reason unknown? Are they part of some kind of larger apparatus? Was there some sort of significance to them? Or were there simply some structures that were designated as structures that were to survive destruction, because remember, you've got a weapon that can destroy a building, but then leave the building right next to it standing in perfect condition. Then that's another explanation for it. Now, as always, I don't know exactly what happened, but these are the discrepancies that we have to try to look at and answer. Now, here's another image of Iowa State University. And oddly enough, you'll see perhaps a little bit more what you'd expect to see. And this was taken from the roof of that old main building, which perished in a fire itself. I believe this building right here is still standing. I believe that one still is, and maybe this one here to the right. But what you see is far fewer trees. Now, when Iowa State University started, it was the Iowa Model Farm in the 1850s. Why in the heck they needed a model farm when it was a brand new state and people were still settling it, I don't know, but that's what you have. And then they converted it into a state university with the Morrill Act. Morale. I like to have fun with that. But these are very odd images because, well, it's not really showing destruction of the land. Well, just bear with me. It's showing the transition of the land, which is very strange to me. It's also strange how quickly this university grew up and why there was so much pronouncement to it very quickly. Now, where you will see the desiccated or arid land, as I like to call it, is in these Civil War photos or these railway construction photos. And in places like Tennessee or other places in the South, you'll oddly enough start to see this. Now, we have trees in the background, but it always gives you the impression of everything being dead. Now, there's explanations for it. It could be winter. It could just be one of those rough times. But as you look at more of these images, you start to get the impression that the land everywhere is like this, as though it's dead, as though it's been rendered into some kind of dust, as though nothing's really growing in it. Now, certain other areas of the image, you'll see there are trees growing in it. This is just one of the early examples. We've got some more profound examples, such as this, where it looks like the entire area has been bombed. Now, it's a Civil War photo. It was bombed by those mighty cannons and those mortars that were everywhere. That's the official explanation. But again, when you look in the horizon, you see that it looks like the very land itself has been reduced to dust, or at least what we'd expect to see ash in one of those post-apocalyptic destruction movies, such as, The Day After. Again, I'm just throwing out examples here. So, hey, New West Reset, thank you for that. I really need to get on my game here with recognizing this and make sure that I do. I appreciate that very much. Now, let's see. Where were we? Oh, there's a good question there from Michael. What are those stacks? I don't know. Is that a factory that was spared? Is it something else? Looked at these images before. I mean, is it some kind of large facility that survived? I mean, it looks like we've got like a chimney over here, but who knows what it really was. Very, very strange. I mean, really, it's supposed to be a wrecked rail yard depot from the Civil War, and that's about all the information you'll get on it. But again, you've got the same issue with the sky, not a cloud in sight, so who really knows what's going on? Although just about every photo from the Civil War is very interesting at best. Here we have a 1890s image of what is today the University of Iowa, not to be confused with Iowa State University. This is Eastern Iowa. But this is the original capital of Iowa. And oddly enough, we do have snow on the ground, so perhaps that's what can explain what we see here with the trees looking dead. It's winter, okay, fine, I can understand it. Looks like the river here is frozen. But again, you get this impression that there's some odd things with this photo. Now again, I'm just walking in this very slowly. I'm not going right to the most profound photographic evidence. And remember, photos are clues. We don't know for sure. But you go back and you look at Chicago. Oh, I always enjoy these images where they've got the full trolley cars and horses pulling them on rails going right through town. Now, even if you accept all the explanations given for why they decided to develop the trolley car to be pulled by horses first, it's very intriguing to think of having rails that go right through town. It's also interesting to think of the tractive force required to pull these carts. Or were they just improvising with what they had on hand? I don't really know. What I do know is that you see unbelieved destruction here, and this is Chicago again. And again, just referencing Chicago because this is all in the same general geographical area. Or was it? Official history tells us it was. But imagine if this really encompassed a greater portion of the land. And again, other issues with this photo that we're not going to cover here. Now, I show this image. This is to show you what the Mississippi River Valley looks like today. This isn't far from Dubuque, Iowa. And what you have are trees and greenery all over the place. It's a very fertile area, as is all the land within Iowa. There's a reason why it's the breadbasket of not just the United States, but considered the breadbasket of the world. Bottom line up front, it's very wonderful soil, and just about anything will grow there, and the soil has wondrous nutrients in it. So this is what you should expect to see. This is what we'd expect to see in these earlier images of Dubuque and these lands in Iowa. And I also include this particular image because this was featured in one of our explorations of Atlanta, where we saw how some of these transient, now officially this is considered a train station, which is quite laughable. And Atlanta is interesting in and of itself because of the fact that they really rebuilt the city from nothing, because you remember General Sherman burned it, or at least Union forces burned it to the ground as part of the Civil War. And less than 20 years later, they rebuilt it very quickly with structures like this. And oh, by the way, they threw up that very impressive state capitol that they have in Georgia and Atlanta in just a few short years. Yeah, they didn't need no 10 or 15 years. They did it in a very short amount of time. But then you look at these other images here, and this is an image of the destruction from the Peshtigo fire, the one in Wisconsin. And here's what you'll see, where it looks like the soil, the land itself has been completely destroyed or rendered into some sort of dust. And in the background, you can see maybe the trees are burned. I'm not really sure. That's always the issue with some of these photos that we have. We would love to see more. I'd love to be able to pan and walk around and really assess all of it. But, we can't. We just have the photo at single perspective. Very, very interesting, though, how we just always seem to have people hanging around as though there's nothing better to do. Yes, it looks like a massive fire rolled through here. Well, let's go get our tea at the burned down cafe nearby. Yeah, I mean, you can't even joke about it because it really just doesn't make any flippin' sense from any perspective, however you want to go about it. Yeah, Steve, I mean, and that's why that comes up a lot, because that's what it looks like. Was it a mud flood, or in this case, was it an ash flood? I mean, you see everything. We think a plasma reset. Maybe it was everything. Maybe they came in and they cleaned this area out to make sure that nobody had any kind of resources that they could use. You have to rely on the new authorities. Otherwise, you're not going to survive. It's really that simple. Ishko, one thing is for sure, you have to be beyond brainwashed to believe stories like the Chicago Cow Fire story. Well, you throw enough stories at people, and that's all they've ever heard, and that's all they ever think. So it's all interesting considerations. Hey, RB, good to see you. Our timeline was stretched. This version of humanity that we incarnate into hasn't even been around that long. I'm inclined to agree with that, RB. I mean, and it seems like the timeline is stretched for a variety of reasons, because a lot of it doesn't make any sense, especially when you try to look at all these events and try to reconcile with how they happened. Ah, yes. Now, again, more destruction from the Peshtigo fire. And again, you see this. It looks like the land has been reduced to total ash. And, well, of course, that makes sense. Everything was on fire. But what would really cause that kind of destruction? The official story is, well, there was a comet, there was a meteorite. But then you've got accounts of this orb device that's spraying fire on everything. So what really happened? The answer is, I don't know. But we've certainly seen images like this, and we've certainly seen images like this in every post-apocalyptic film and image we have of destruction. Oddly enough, it looks like some buildings survived, but again, why did they? Why were others completely destroyed? It's very, very intriguing when you try to think of it. Now, looking at the modern-day Iowa State University, I just included this in here because I tried to explore these particular structures in the past. This is Curtis Hall. It is standing where that old main was that we looked at earlier. So when the old main building burned down in the start of the 1900s, they threw up this little beauty. And really, this is the rival of any state capitol that you'll see. It's the main administration building for Iowa State University. And of course, we see our classic symbols on it, our favorite cartouche. And then, of course, we have our little leaf motifs on it. Because I guess not only did they represent government functions, they also represented a state university, because why not? Quite fascinating. Now, still staying on that topic, what you'll see, though, when you look at a lot of the earlier photos of Iowa, is oddly enough, there's images that the land appears to be desiccated or arid or destroyed. And if that were indeed the case, and if you really were trying to get the soil to actually have nutrients in it, then suddenly having a model farm makes a lot more sense. We need to have a laboratory or laboratory. I can't wait for people to make fun of me for mispronouncing words. It's all good. We need to have a laboratory so we can figure out how to get nutrients back in the soil. And we need to do that at a model farm. Why does a model farm need a big giant smokestack? I don't know. Don't ask. It was for power generation because we needed power before we had electricity, right? I'll stop with that. But the early images just create more questions. And this is another very early image of Iowa State University, Iowa State College, the Iowa Model Farm. And here you'll see there's virtually no trees, but apparently they had this impetuousness, this drive to plant all these trees very quickly. And again, you'll see that oddly enough, the land looks very desiccated and destroyed. And remember, this is Iowa. This is where corn will grow anywhere. This is where you've got trees everywhere. You just need a water source, and there's plenty of water to be found. But oddly enough, in these early images that are stated to be from central Iowa, the land itself looks dead. And no, the land doesn't even look this dead during winter. It's very, very odd because, again, we've got that impression of it being covered with ash. Now, I don't know. I can't tell for sure. I'm not coming to any final conclusions. I say impressions and I say clues because that's all a photo is going to give us. Maybe it was just a really bad photo. Maybe it degraded over its storage time. Who knows for sure? But there's too many photos that show those same clues for us to ignore. I am Kairos. Looks crop past the buildings. I would agree, my friend. I would agree. Very much so. It does look that way. Mary, great observation there. No animals either. Yes, very interesting. No animals on the model farm as of yet. I really wonder why. And here you have this image. This is a contemporary image of what it looks like in Iowa, pretty much anywhere you look. Now, granted, this isn't winter. This is taken before harvest time, but this just gives you an idea that this is not a destroyed land. This is a land that has a lot of life to it. And you may recall in our Iowa State Capitol construction photo where we've got trees that go right up to the building that haven't been cleared. We have our usual, let's stage the rubble to construct the building. And let's just completely ignore the fact that the building itself looks rather bombed out and burned out. Now, who knows what the story is with this dome that's not there and this stick that someone seems to have, I don't know, drawn on the photo. We've seen this before. It's very, very strange. Maybe the dome is there, or maybe it's not even a real photo. It was composited over time to show how they constructed it. Again, I'm not suggesting that anybody's trying to deceive anything. It's just one of those odd pictures. The other really odd thing is how at that time, even though the entire Capitol grounds of the Iowa State Capitol are cleared out, it's this massive open piece of terrain, there are all these houses that came right up to it. Very, very strange. I mean, as I understood it, I thought the entire plot of land, and you can look at the original bird's eye view, the planning map of Des Moines, Iowa, they had all this land earmarked for the Capitol building. So why in the heck would anybody be allowed to build these ramshackle houses right up to it? It's very, very strange. Now, you look at other places in Iowa, and this is Dubuque, and in the distant horizon here, you don't get the impression of trees. You get the impression that the land is, again, very desiccated, arid. There's dust and dirt and ash. But you still have these very impressive, beautiful towers, many of which still stand today in Dubuque, Iowa. It's a very interesting place to visit. I recommend it if you're ever there. But then you see these other images of random train stations anywhere across the South. And you'll see the same thing. Now, South, I'm, of course, talking about Tennessee, Georgia, from the quote-unquote Civil War. And you have this odd compilation of these structures here, but then you look in the background, and again, I mean, it's hard to tell, but it gives you the impression that the land is just dead in a way that seems to be beyond it being the winter time. Now, I'm still not showing the most elaborate or dramatic photos. Now, here is a picture of a house in Dubuque on what's called the Four Mountains Conference Center. You can still go and stay in this house today. I believe they operate it as a bed and breakfast. I think you can still rent the entire house. But you'll notice here, you're looking at the Mississippi River Valley, there are very few trees. There's also some odd object here. I mean, it may just be an error with the photo. Who knows for sure? I'm not saying it's showing anything, but it's really odd that you can find no shortage of photos that show that there are no trees at all in the entire Mississippi River Valley around Dubuque. Now, the official explanation will be they cut down all the trees, and that's what happened to them because they were building all these wood buildings, or they weren't. But then, oddly enough, on some of the bird's eye view maps of Dubuque, Iowa, you'll see that there's virtually no trees anywhere in the surrounding bluffs when they're completely covered with them. So it's all a lot of strange attempted explanations. I mean, is this logging going on here, or this almost looks like Tunguska? And again, this is supposed to be logging that's occurring in the Mississippi River Valley. So what, we killed all the trees and then we're going to knock them down? I mean, what exactly is going on here? And none of these individuals really even seem to have a saw or anything. I guess maybe this guy has an axe. So they were doing all this themselves. Yeah, we got a crew of 3. It's going to take us a long time. Oh, wait, 4. There's one guy over there. Going to take us a long time. But I mean, you see odd images like this. I mean, maybe, but again, it's very strange. They decided to go snap a picture, or did something else knock down all these trees? I mean, I don't know. I mean, sure, given a long enough timeline, and these guys look like really hard workers because, I mean, especially the guy right here. I mean, he's got to be a hard worker. Look how he's standing there. Oh, there's actually 5 guys. I missed another one. Probably look a little bit further, but it's really, really strange because you see images like this that give you different impressions in terms of what happened to the land. And it's not exactly how you'd expect to see some sort of organized logging process. Well, then what people will tell you is, well, these were settlers. They didn't exactly know what they were doing and they didn't have an organized operation. Fine, but they were still the same people that were able to build those incredible state capitol buildings and county courthouses that you can still go and visit anywhere in Iowa or the Midwest or the land today. It's one of those things that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. New West reset. They're scavenging firewood from a tornado or something. That would make a little bit more sense, wouldn't it? Maybe somebody should have said that. Battlestar Utarian posers. Yeah, you got to get your blocking right. Make sure you're posing properly. So it's just, you get images like that, and it really causes you to question things. You go back to Chicago here, and here you have this very incredibly beautiful building, this very ornate building that has decorations above every single window. And yet it seems as though, here we have another one of these diagonal cuts. The building seems to have been gutted from the inside. And we're completely surrounded by rubble, and it even almost looks like a junkyard. Now, if you look closely, you'll see some individuals here. But I mean, this just looks like apocalyptic destruction. The photos of Hiroshima after World War II. What's supposed to be a documented and verified nuclear attack. Well, where did somebody get the idea? Why does this idea of these cities being destroyed in this way terrify us psychologically so much? And believe me, these images do, and they're very effective at doing that. I mean, you look at some of the destruction here in the background. What the heck is going on with this image? Very, very odd. I think even all of you can see this that I'm seeing here, even though it's smaller for you. Very strange. And this is what always causes me to question. I mean, was this photo modified in some way? Was this blurred out for some reason? Is this the original photo? Or was it just natural damage over time? And it just happened to damage the background, causing us not to even be able to see what actually happened to these buildings. Was there something even more pronounced that they didn't want us to see? Well, it's the thoughts of paranoia. Yeah, sure. Everyone's always paranoid until they're not. But it's really odd. I mean, you can see it right up here with what's going on with, I mean, that's what happens on all these images. So that's why I always say they only provide clues. We're not going to be allowed to see the truth. And maybe it's done intentionally to get us to look in the wrong direction, but I don't think that it is because, again, there's too many examples of it. Helena Jennings, some folks even had elongated heads. Oh, yes, they did. Quite extensive, too. KC933, the whole photo is bunk. Yeah, probably quite a bit of it, I would say. So moving on from this particular image, I include this little image from Beneath the Planet of the Apes because it's one of my favorite matte paintings of all time. It's what's left in New York City before astronaut Brent and Nova went down there and encountered the mutant civilization. Oddly enough, though, they do include this mentality of all this rubble, and yet many of the buildings are still standing. So if you ever look at the history of the screenwriter behind Beneath the Planet of the Apes, he had quite an interesting history, kind of similar to Christopher Lee, and yet came up with these ideas, apparently on their own and fresh. And then just an image here showing the construction of the great pedestal that the Statue of Liberty stands upon. Of course, you're not going to see the fort that the pedestal's on because who'd want to see that? That's kind of boring. And, we have our usual image of everybody standing around and posing. Well, how'd you ever get that built in time? I don't know. Now, here's another one of these really odd images that we have of what's supposed to be a rail depot yard. And again, you see the same thing. A lot of rubbling and destruction. What, we're just building walls out here for no real reason to stage the cars by? And I mean, you look at this, you kind of see everything in this particular image. The widespread destruction, the arid land. Now, this is purportedly a Civil War photo from a depot in Tennessee. I think this is near Chattanooga. Again, if the photo is correct, let's see what it says down here. It looks like Georgia Railroad, but okay, so that would make sense. But it's very, very odd what we see, how we really can't reconcile this destruction and Why we have random buildings? Well, Sherman's army went through. It's very well documented. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, yeah. Just like Sherman's army took a wrong turn and went up to Chicago, too, right? Now, I just included this because this is very peculiar. The infrastructure that this train is going across, this bridge looks very, how shall we say, ramshackle. Yeah, I don't think I'd want to take a train across that, but I'm not driving the train, so it's all good. But even the infrastructure here, these blocks look a lot older. Even in this photo, they look a lot older. It was like how we have individuals standing up all over the place. Now it makes you wonder what happened. Did they have to improvise a very ramshackle bridge here? Well, there was a war going on. Someone destroyed the bridge and they had to improvise a ramshackle bridge. It's just another one of those interesting things that you see that doesn't really add up. But then you'll see other discrepancies like this rail yard where you have this very well constructed depot over here with some very precise construction. I guess, you need to build rail depots as castles in some places because it's just not hard enough to do that in other locations. You can see some even more dramatic buildings here in the background of this image. And again, I think this is Atlanta or Tennessee. But I'm always impressed with how they were able to even build these very impressive locomotives. And keep in mind, these locomotives were much larger than what we tend to think. So all very, very strange. And you see a little bit of life in the background here with the terrain, but these are the images that give us the clues that there was a lot of destruction going on at that time. So, oh, thanks, Helena. I appreciate that. Well, you do this long enough, and yeah, it all starts to look the same. But if you look at it in enough detail, it doesn't look the same. So, yeah, music says they had so many trains, they smashed them up. Yeah, as if they had more trains than they knew what to do with. So they were just going to waste them. So, Uba Khan here asks a great question. Where'd they build the locomotives? Where were the plants? Don't know. We don't know. It's just like finding all those brick factories that were in St. Louis, Missouri. We don't know where they are. You'll find remnants, or at least purported remnants. So that's the interesting thing about it. So that concludes all of our destroyed cities and lifeless lands. And hopefully that gives you an idea of what a lot of the evidence that we have really is. And yes, many other explorers have looked at this. And really what we're doing is we're tying this all together. Are we seeing the results of this post-reset horror? The land completely destroyed, select structures that were left standing, junk and debris all over the place, and people who were completely forced to rely on the authorities at that time because they had no means to sustain themselves. These are all the hints and clues that we're seeing. Now, I wanted to take a quick look and go back with this whole erratic population change and show you this. Now, these are from mainstream historical documents, so don't get wrapped around the bend on that. Let me share this image here. We've got a couple charts that we'll look at. And of course, anybody can show us whatever they want to, but you look at something like this, U.S. resident population, and it looks like it's a nice steady curve. We always love our terms about curves on charts. Let me make sure you can see this before I go on, because this is rather dramatic. So what it's telling us here is that it's very natural. 1790, the United States became a nation, and then its population grew on a nice curve. But for those of you who watched the population exploration, which was released about last year at this time, we noticed that they hide a lot of the immense growth that occurred from 1790 to 1910 in this. But if you look at this, going from, about 10 million people to 100 million people in about 100 years, you're looking at some rather extensive growth. You're looking almost at some rather impossible growth, dare I say. Now, if you look at it from 1910, it's 100 million to about 300 million in 2010. Yes, I do remember the Mandela effect where there were 400 million people in the United States in the 1990s. Now just say, Aurelian, your mind is broken or you fell for a psyop. That's fine. You want to say that or think that, that's fine. I'm just saying I have a memory where I recall reading population reports in the United States that we were already past 400 million in the 1990s. Maybe I'm not remembering it properly. Maybe I'm crazy. All those are possible. But on this chart that we have from the U.S. Census Bureau, it seems that there's no growth from 1790 to 1910. But if you do the percentage of growth, it actually comes out to about 1,000% growth. How feasible is that? Well, it's immigration. That's what we'll be told. We'll look at that in a second. But from 1910 to 2010, well, then you're only looking at about, 300% growth. Still exceptional, but certainly not like 1,000% growth. And keep in mind, we had poorer technology, poorer health, and more difficulties. But yet somehow this chart makes you think that the population grew more substantially. Yes, in raw numbers it did, but in terms of exponential increase, what happened from 1790 to 1910 is crazy, and this chart conceals it very, very well, and effectively, I might add. Now, oddly enough, the other discrepancy that you have is what was the true native population, the Native Americans. Now, of course, no Native American calls himself a Native American. They refer to what tribe or what nation they're a part of. So let's just keep that in mind. So if anybody in the comments section randomly says they're a Native American, well, okay, just be sure you say what tribe and nation. You'll seem a little more convincing then, okay? Anyways, year 1800 to 1890, we see a decrease in the Native American population. We see a substantial decrease, well over 50%. And so you can't say it was Native Americans. Now, there's a lot of debate in terms of what the Native American population was. Some people say it was 10 million. Some people say it was more. We have no idea of knowing. And I refuse to believe that anybody in 1800 in the nascent United States is going out and did a population count. How the heck would they even do it? I do believe, though, that there was a catastrophic loss of life. I think that's one account that the official history does convey to us. Now, how catastrophic was that loss of life? Who knows for sure? But it is captured by mainstream history. So as the saying goes, make of it what you will. And let me make sure I catch that. Who was that? Captain Krampus. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thank you for joining us. But you look at these incredible population changes. So you've got population going up, you've got population going down. What's the real account? Well, I thought I'd poke out something else, not just the United States, but the population of Ireland. And apparently someone was taking a population count of Ireland all the way back in 1200. I don't know. Maybe, the Kingdom of England was doing it because they were bored. I'm not sure. But you can see how it kind of fluctuated a little bit. But then very strangely, in 1800, there was this incredible increase in the population of Ireland. From 1800 to right before the Great Potato Famine in the mid-1800s, the population went from 4 million to 9 million. Then the potato famine hit, and then it went from 9 million to 4 million. Very, very strange. Now, the official explanation will be, well, what started the Industrial Revolution was that they modified and revolutionized the farms and farming efforts and fertilizers, and that's how we explain this incredible population growth. Although I find it very interesting that just having the availability of food alone is what will cause the population to grow. It's almost like we're playing some kind of simulation game, a 4X simulation game. Not Master of Orion 3, because that one wasn't fun. But you'll notice these odd discrepancies. This very, very stagnant population for hundreds of years, and then all of a sudden, kablooey, it goes through the roof. It's not just the United States. Here it is in Ireland, in the same time frame, the 1800s. You have a lot of life all of a sudden, and then you have a lot of death. It was the potato famine. It's well documented. Yes, as are many other famines that are well documented. And yet, for some reason, we have bizarre monuments to famines. I mean, look, I'm all about memorializing the victims, but if you ever look at these monuments, they are very horrific. They show the human suffering. Is that to remind us of how people suffered in the past? Or is it a warning? Well, you make of it what you will. Now, this, of course, it's not going to let me zoom in on this. Well, the good news is, since somehow by magic the Reddit page is back up, you know what? I think I'm going to post this on the channel community page just for everybody to see. But this is actually a contemporary document that shows you, and contemporary, this was published in 1890. Remember, something happened to the census in the United States in 1890. But it actually shows you the breakdown of the population between people born in the United States and the immigrants at that time. In other words, there's no way in heck that the immigrants could account for this 1,000% population growth. Now, if you go back and you watch the population video, you might notice that certain cities have more than a 1,000% population growth in a very short amount of time, like Des Moines, Seattle, where you're talking 100,000% population growth. Virtually impossible by any means, but yeah, they say it all happened. Anyway, I'm sorry this image isn't better. Let me go on to the next one. Then there's also this account of everything happening in the 1800s with urbanization. 1876, baseball started. I remember when baseball was the premier sport in the United States. I guess we still play it and care about it, but Chicago builds the first 10-story skyscraper in 1885 after the fire. And then we have the electric trolley in 1887. Oh, so no more horses to pull the trolleys in 1887, apparently. We've got the Whole House in Chicago, and we've got how the City Beautiful movement begins. Now, the City Beautiful movement is quite intriguing because that's how we attribute all this success and all these incredible, beautiful downtowns that we have across the United States. Of course, I guess City Beautiful went to Europe too because they built a lot of structures in the 1890s, even though Europe had already been settled for hundreds of years and had plenty of time to build incredible cathedrals. But they needed the City Beautiful movement too, I guess, according to the official history. And then, as if that isn't odd enough, Coney Island Amusement Park opens in 1895. Now, I haven't done an exploration in amusement parks personally. I know other explorers have, and I'm going to have to get to it because it's very intriguing how this just all falls together, all within this 10-year time frame. Oh, by the way, you know what else they say that they fully invented in 1890? Heavy machinery. Even though, again, there's conflicting accounts. Well, we had certain diggers and excavators that were steam powered and they could actually operate at that time. But again, it gives you this real mishmash of all this stuff happening all at the same time in the 1800s. A very conflicted and strange and bizarre timeline. Hey, Clara, good to see you. Oh, yeah, no doubt about it. So that's the erratic population changes. And, you don't even have to go down and look in terms of if a city even had a sufficient population to build the buildings. You can just look at the fact that the population growth in the United States or in select cities is crazy. It doesn't make any sense. You're talking about astronomically impossible numbers and impossible growth. So, Jamie Griffin, you've had too much to think. Yeah, there you go. That's exactly what people will tell you, too. Just accept it. It all makes sense. Of course, a population can grow 1,000, 10,000, 200,000%. It all makes sense, right? Yeah, if only investments did so well, right? Nobody'd have any concerns in the world. So, one final thing I'll leave with for this exploration, going from these insane population numbers, or, very sane, very well documented population numbers according to official history, we'll take a look at some strange observations from this time frame. And so, again, we're in that very interesting time frame of the 1800s, which was also known as the Victorian era. Now, you might be surprised to know that two of our current monsters or non-human stories emanate from the 1800s. Bram Stoker's Dracula in the later 1800s and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in the early 1800s. That's what the official history says. But what you have here is all these images of all these strange creatures that were being seen at that time. Yes, all these cryptids and all this other strange stuff that was going on in the 1800s. And so this is the strange observations that we have, the last part of this exploration. So you have these mystery airships, you have these destroyed cities, this arid, desiccated land, these accounts that don't make sense. You have these accounts of destruction beyond anybody's imagination, but you understand it to be at different locations at different times. But when you step far enough back and look at it holistically, along with the population numbers fluctuating, it suddenly makes a lot more sense if this was one tremendous event, the post-reset horror. What was the last part of the post-reset horror? All these remaining life forms. Now, were these monsters, were these creatures? I'm not sure. Now let's play a little game here on image recognition. Is this a real image from a real city, or is this some sort of fabricated image? What are your thoughts? What do you all think on this one? Mermaids to endure the reset. Yeah, no doubt about it. Hey, Adam, good to see you, brother. Only the strange remains the same. Yeah, that seems to be very true. What do we got there? The little season theory. Real, real, fake. Oh, real. Okay, does anybody know where this is? Ah, Sean P. Yeah, you should recognize that Art Deco building. I did explore this. Complete, says Jared. Ah, Steve Pepper, you got it. This is Buffalo. And I will sort out all your questions because this is actually a real image. So what you have here are a couple of little towers that were built to resemble the mausoleum of Helicanarsis on the top of buildings in Buffalo. And you have that very impressive Art Deco City Hall, which is a very real building. Now, it's really interesting to me that when a picture is taken from a certain perspective, that suddenly it transforms the perception of the city. Yeah, there's that really impressive obelisk too out in front of the city hall. So if you're keen on it, go back and watch the Buffalo exploration. And I think OWE did a pretty good coverage on Buffalo if you want to check out his work. So, but anyway, yeah. So a real picture, but taken from a perspective that shows us a bunch of old world buildings, we question the veracity of it. I'll be honest with you, I explored the freaking city and I questioned the veracity of the photo. But this is a real image. These are real buildings that you can explore to this day. You could actually get in this position. I don't know if you can fly a drone up there. Don't take my word of it. It might be illegal, because everything's illegal now. But you could actually get in this position and take this picture and see this. No, this doesn't look like what you'd think is a contemporary city, but this is a real image. It's just something to remain cognizant of with the strange observations that we have. And just something I want you to be aware of as we go forward. Oh, yeah. Well, it's New York, the Empire State, the Statue of Liberty. Now, what's really odd about the Victorian era in the 1800s is that all these accounts of all these little creatures. There's accounts of people having gardens and having homeless people dressed up as gnomes. Were they dressed up as gnomes or were they really gnomes? It's really, really odd when you look up all the strange things that occurred during the Victorian era. You also have odd accounts that occurred in the sky at that time. Astronomical phenomenon, this push to build all these observatories everywhere. And yes, I'm going to get back to exploring the observatories a little bit more closely. But what were these astronomical phenomenon? Were they actually seeing things or were they astrological phenomenon? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? I don't know. Well, Carl Sagan will tell you that astrology is, never mind. I'm not going to go down that road. But there were all these observations of strange things going on in the sky. So then you add that on top of everything else with these mystery airships, this fire from the sky. And then you also look at this very interesting depiction of Frankenstein. This was from the short film that was produced by Thomas Edison, of all people. And while it may look a little silly, this is a very terrifying rendition of Frankenstein, the very early days of cinema, the very early 1900s, apparently. And then, of course, we have Dracula. And what's interesting about Dracula, and of course, I've got the great Christopher Lee there, the definitive Dracula. It's always associated with old world buildings, as is the original Count with Bram Stoker. Very fascinating in and of itself. And then you also have what Frankenstein may have really been, what it really represented, the ability to create artificial beings. And so the ability to create artificial beings that were very similar to humans, and there's other names for them, replicants, fabricants, and yet the story, the origin story as we understand it, was in Frankenstein. The actual monster of Frankenstein, which remember was not called Frankenstein. Frankenstein was the name of the doctor. So the story tells you who the real person of horror is. It's not the creature that was created. It was the person who decided to create the creature, in this case, Dr. Frankenstein. Yeah, I know, I'm spelling out the moral message for you. But you look at the early representations of what it really was, and suddenly you put it on top of everything that we just looked at with this post-reset horror. What if you had creatures like this that were running around at that time? Or what if we are the remnants of these creatures, these new humans, if you will? Or maybe it's something else entirely going on. We don't know for sure, but there's all these different disturbing possibilities. Now, I'm certainly not looking to impinge or infringe upon anyone's belief systems. You're welcome to believe whatever you want to. I'm suggesting different possibilities. It's just very strange that there's all this overlap of everything that occurred in the 1800s and these views that we have. It's very, very strange. And I don't think it's very easy to reconcile either. Cheetahs cheat. Artists remembering the horror and confusion of their past lives. And that's probably a lot of it too. You do see that and how it's ingrained in our minds and why we just can't let it go. Vaughn, if we are, I'm sure they didn't plan on us waking up. No, I don't think really anybody planned on that. Sky Sage, I'm glad you brought up Darwin's theory of evolution because guess what else came from the 1800s? Yep, that's right. Darwin's theory of evolution. No, you can't make this stuff up. Yeah, Ishka says it very well there. The strangest point or strangest period in history. And who knows what it is? Was it really 100 years long? Was it actually just 10, 15 years long? It's very strange. The amount of things that occurred, that we say occurred with population, structures, nations, societies being completely reordered, doesn't make a lot of sense. A kinetogram, that's what they called a film in 1910. The Edison kinetogram. See, Edison invented everything else and he invented modern film. Kind of a terrifying creature almost with the hands. And I'm reminded of our look last week at the interesting account from the mutants of Beneath the Planet of the Apes, because if you look at the description, what the screenwriter had in mind, it looked like our good old-fashioned plague doctor. No, say it isn't so. You also have the whole concept of Jekyll and Hyde. Now, does that point to different types of humans, or does that point to something else that they were doing, looking into the darker nature that could be brought out of human beings? I haven't explored Jekyll and Hyde yet either, but the concept is interesting. Oh, and again, showing you that they had the capacity to make some very interesting photographs at that time. So why is it only some photographs are not to be questioned, but others are very clearly questionable? Unless you really believe that, yeah, they captured a presence of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde here. I mean, it's really strange. You see all these interesting photos from that time frame. Vaughn, funny how close Dracula and Frankenstein's monster become, like they were from the same house. Yes, isn't it? And even all these different monsters, they're still under the universal monster umbrella to this day, the quote-unquote intellectual property. So, I am Kairos. Tom Hanks. Watch out now. He's going to be starring in a Jekyll and Hyde movie. That's really causing me to crack up. So, Opie, they were written together by the authors. That may be possible. New West Reset. Upload a vintage footage video every week. 30 to 40% of the footage I find is Edison films. Isn't it interesting? All the stuff that's attributed to Edison, too. All the technology, even at his own concrete company. I remember that from the stadium exploration. So, yeah, quite intriguing, isn't it? So, anyway, this is what we have, and this is what we close the exploration on. So, in review, we looked at the post-reset horror. We talked about mystery airships and fire from the sky, destroyed cities and lifeless lands, erratic population changes, and then the strange observations from the 1800s. And so I hope this gives you a means of looking at how all these events may be tied together. Now, as always, I don't know, but it does seem that these things fit much better together within even the given chronology if we consider these other explanations. Now, that's just my mind, that's just my theory, and I'm sharing that openly with you. So, Donut said something good here. We read in lies and live in lies. English is a language which is designed to confuse you. English is not the only language that's designed to confuse you, but I will agree that some languages are designed to confuse you a little bit more than others, especially when you talk about all the pronunciations and dialect changes. So, very, very true. Atom bomb. Edison was a robber baron, thief. Yes. What's that other term we have? A modern term. Oligarch. Gee, who do we call an oligarch now? Don't call anybody an oligarch. So, anyways. Well, I hope you enjoyed this exploration of the post-reset horror. Please be sure before you depart, if you haven't already done so, to hit the like button. And I'm going to look to get a little bit more of a classic edge to the explorations back. We'll see what comes up this week, and I'm going to look to get on the ground. There's an observatory that's not too far from where I am, and I would like to do an on-site of that and share one of those, because it's been a while since I've done an on-site exploration, and see how that goes over. If you like it, great. And if not, we'll move on to something else. So I'm open to doing anything and everything. So it was really good to see everybody. Thank you for joining us for the live show. And I really, really appreciate everything you have to contribute. And I know I missed a lot of stuff on this particular one. So I'm going to go back and reread this again because I love your comments and I love the ideas that you share. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, everybody who's going to be watching this in the future. Please hit the like button, and we'll see you later this week. And this is Lucius Aurelian signing off. And please join us for live stream next week.